Hello, and today we're looking at demystifying the internal conflict behind power and conflict poetry. The issues that a lot of students come to us with as English teachers when it comes to power and conflict poetry, namely, what do you need to do in the exam? What are the best poems to learn? And what quotations should you use when you're having a go at answering the power and conflict poetry question? So the first thing, looking at what you actually need to do in the exam. The power and conflict poetry is on English Literature Paper 2, which is the 2 hour and 15-minute exam. For some of you, this will be the last English literature paper you do, if you're not going to go on and do it A-level or beyond. And it's also important to note that you'll be quite tired by the time you come to power and conflict poetry. You'll have done a question on inspector calls, which is marked out of 30, and then 4 for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. Then you go on to power and conflict poetry. So you'll have 45 minutes on inspector calls, 45 minutes on power and conflict poetry, 45 minutes on unseen poetry. Power and conflict is out of 30, unseen poetry is out of 24, and then out of 8 as well for question 2. The reason I mention that is you'll be tired. If you think about English Literature Paper 1, which is Macbeth and Frankenstein, you get 15 minutes to plan and read. You get 45 minutes Macbeth, 45 minutes Frankenstein. Here, you are straight into it. You're planning for 5 minutes, writing for 40 on inspector calls, planning for 5, writing for 40 on power and conflict. And you can't afford to spend any longer than that 45 minutes, because if you do, it will have a knock-on effect on everything else. Unseen poetry questions 1 and 2 between them are worth more than some of the other sections there. So you need to make sure you're spending time on every set component of the paper to give yourself the best chance of doing well. You should spend 45 minutes answering the power and conflict poetry question, and as I've said before, you're going to get a mark out of 30. That's quite interesting for revision purposes. Get used to planning for 5 minutes. Basically, when you get into the exam, the first thing you should do is look at the questions. So you look at the inspector calls question, you write down your quotations for inspector calls as quickly as you can, and then start writing your inspector calls essay. Some of you might want to look at the power and conflict poetry question and think, right, okay, do you know what? I've got some quotations here. I just want to get them down on paper first, write them on the exam paper so you've got them there. That's absolutely fine. Do what works for you, and then deal with unseen when you get to it, because of course there's no quotations to learn there because you're going to see the poem fresh. Please make sure that you are compartmentalizing each section of the exam paper. What I mean by that is you will all have different strengths and weaknesses. Some of you might be brilliant at inspector calls, for instance. So obviously when you get the question, you've looked at the question and it's Sheila, and you've revised Sheila in depth because you revised all the characters in depth, ready for any question that's going to come up. Great, you think you smashed your inspector calls answer. Compartmentalize it, then deal with power and conflict poetry separately. If you get into power and conflict poetry and it's a question on a theme that you perhaps don't particularly like, or a poem maybe that you get given in the exam that you're not quite as, you don't perhaps enjoy as much, or you haven't quite revised in as much depth as the others, compartmentalize it, deal with the question, do the best job you can for that 45 minutes. Spend that 45 minutes answering. So think about what you're going to say, think about your quotations, think about a good second poem to compare, and then write for that time. For revision, 5 minutes planning, 40 minutes writing. That's what you should be doing, certainly over the Easter holidays and in the weeks leading up to the exam. That's what we'll be doing in class with you as well, because it works itself well to a lesson. And when you get in the exam, you get given a theme to compare. The theme is the most important part. I'll come back to that later on. Many students get into the exam though, and they're looking for the poem that you get given. And you see that, you don't hear it obviously in the exam, you're in silence, but you see that collective, oh yes, it's war photographer, thank God I can answer on war photographer. Or, oh no, it's tissue or the emigre or whatever it is, We'll deal with that in a second there, but it's really important that you focus on the theme in the question, not just the poem that you get given, because ultimately you might not like the poem you've got given, but the theme might be really accessible, and actually it might enable you to use the poem that you are going to bring in. You've got to compare the poem you're given to another poem. It might actually enable you to answer really, really well on the other poem, not necessarily the poem you've got in front of you. And we do see that quite often when we're looking at these as examiners and as markers in the department. The other thing to say is you get a list of all the poems and poets. I've seen students use this really creatively in the past. In the heat of the moment, in a 2 hour, 15-minute exam where you're tired, you spent 45 minutes writing as much as you can on inspector calls, you've got to spend just 45 minutes. You've probably just had a great idea that you're going to write about Mr. Burling. You've written it down really quickly. You've turned the page to power and conflict poetry. In that time, you'd be going frantic. Right, what's the poem I've got? What's the question I've got? Okay, what do I know about this poem I've got? What can I compare it to? What goes well? Having that list of poems there really helps, because you can start to think about what compares well with the poem you've been given, looking at the theme in the question. And sometimes you can go down the list. So you might get a poem on the effects of war, for instance, and you might have revised My Last Duchess. Well, with the greatest respect in the world, you're not going to get My Last Duchess into a war essay. So put a line through it on the paper. Or, right, no, I'm definitely not going to do that. Oh, effects of war, they've given us remains. What do I do? Bayonet charge or exposure? Oh, God. Yeah. And don't spend ages agonising on it. You haven't got time. Pick the one you think would work well and compare best with that as well. But having that list there can help to settle your mind a little bit. So, going on to the best poems to learn. We get asked this all the time by all the students. And the big thing to say is that there is no right or wrong answer to this. I know that's not helpful, particularly people want us as English teachers to have a kind of a magic silver bullet poem that, yeah, this is the one in your back pocket that will allow you to answer any question. Because it depends entirely on the theme in the question and, to a large degree, the poem you get given. We talk about Kamikaze as a department quite a lot, because Kamikaze is a poem that you'll see on the next slide allows you to answer or deal with a couple of questions. You know, it's a poem that contains the beautiful rural imagery of Japan as part of nature. It contains war because, of course, the poem is set in wartime, and it's about the power of man because ultimately the pilot has the power to end his mission, but that leads to disgrace to him and his family. It's about memory because, of course, the pilot has the memory of the flight. The daughter, the narrator of the poem, has the memory of her father's actions, you know, and you've got all sorts of bits and pieces in that poem that enable it to be used for lots and lots of different bits and pieces. You know, you can use it to answer any question there. But if you get Kamikaze in the exam as the poem you've been given, and the poem's on the effects of war, then you can't use it to answer any question because it's there in front of you. You need to come up with a second poem. So it depends on the theme in question and the poem. The other thing to say is there are 330 students in Year 11. Each individual student will inevitably have poems that you like more or you find easier to discuss. There might be one that you were absent when we covered that poem properly, so inevitably your knowledge perhaps isn't going to be as strong as other students. You might be sat next to somebody who really likes a poem and you hate it, and that's absolutely fine, and that happens quite commonly. Even as teachers, there are poems that we like more, some of us like more, some of us don't like more. And that's absolutely fine. You know, you've got to expect there's difference there. There is nothing worse, I guarantee, than when you go into the exam for paper 2 for literature and you're talking to friends before the exam. Oh, what poems have you revised? Oh, well, I've revised Checking Out My History. I've revised The Emigre. I've revised Kamikaze. I've revised Exposure. I've revised Remains, and I've revised Storm on the Island. And of course, they're not the 6 poems you've revised. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Well, I've not revised those. Does this mean I'm going to fail? No, you'll put each other off doing that. And it's important to note that people like things differently, and that's absolutely fine. The other thing to say is, first of all, the exam is an untiered exam. So English literature, English language are untiered. You all do the same exam, and everyone does the same exam. There are about 500,000 students in your year group. Across the country, they will all do the same exam. There's got to be a question, a theme in that question, and a poem that's accessible for everyone. Please bear in mind that all 15 poems are as accessible as each other. So there's no such thing as this is a long one. They're not going to give us that because it costs lots of money to print in the exam booklet. Or, oh, lots of students don't understand tissue, so we're not going to get tissue or another poem. Because what you must understand is you might find that poem difficult. You know, people in your class might find that difficult. People in Penistone might find that difficult. But a school down in London, oh, tissue, yeah, that's dead easy. You know, a school in Liverpool, oh, checking out my history, fine, yeah, no problem, that we understand that one. So everyone will have their strengths and weaknesses. Students within classes there. No poem is easier or harder than another poem. You might think it is, but AQA don't. And when we're setting the question, it's not a case of that's a hard one, we'll give you that one. Because ultimately it might be hard for you, but it's not hard for other students. So when you're looking for things to revise, you need to know what all 15 poems are about. That's the golden rule. They will give you one poem from the 15. You must know what they're all about. If you don't, you are not going to be able to answer any question that comes up. If you know what all 15 are about, you might like some of the 15, you might not like some of the 15, you might feel confident with some of the 15 compared to others, but at least you know that you know what they're all about. So when it comes up, you've got it there in front of you. In an ideal world, you'd then revise all 15 poems in depth. Realistically, in terms of timing, we're saying look at 6 or 7 poems in depth, ideally including some poems that allow you to answer more than one potential question. Kamikaze is a good example. You know, I'm a football fan, so I apologise for a football analogy here. It's a little bit like if I'm picking a squad, I might want a couple of players on the bench who can play more than one position. Kamikaze is my player on the bench who can play more than one position. It can play in defence, it can play in defensive midfield, it can play in midfield sometimes. If I really need to, I can stick it up front if I'm chasing a goal there. And I apologise for that terrible analogy, but that might help you to understand. You know, some of these poems you are learning just purely because they might come up, or if they don't come up, at least you've got that ready to go, because it will enable you to answer lots and lots of different bits of that question, or different potential questions that come up. And even if the poem you get given in the exam is not one of the 6 or 7 that you've revised in depth, if you're sat in the exam and it's Poppies and you've not revised Poppies, you will get a blank copy of the poem Poppies and you'll know what it's about for 2 reasons. First of all, you've just been told to revise all 15 poems in depth to know what they're about. To know what they're about, surface, deeper meaning. We'll get onto that in a second. Secondly, we've done them in class. We have spent hours going over poetry in class. You might not have this, but there are places you can go. Mr. Brough revision videos are great for filling in gaps in your knowledge. 25, 30-minute videos analysing the poem in depth, 6-minute recap videos. The CGP revision guides, you know, the opening paragraph, they sum up the poem in a nutshell. What's this about? So you'll know what they're about without perhaps knowing that in depth, and that's fine. You know, if it's Poppies, if you're not sure what it's about, you'll get a copy of Poppies. So you'll even read it and you think, oh yeah, it's the one with the mother and the son. And then what you'll start to do is look at your 2 to 3 quotations from Poppies that are in front of you there as well. Some of you will have 2 to 3 quotations from these poems that you actually like, you know, you'll remember without knowing, if that makes sense. Think about Extract from the Prelude, another one that tends not to be as popular. Extract from the Prelude. We have done that as an assessment in year 10. Lots of people talk about the huge peak, black and huge, the power of the mountain over Wordsworth. They talk about the trouble to my dreams at the end of the poem, the psychological impact, and they talk about the willow tree at the start. So, you know, that's Extract from the Prelude. They're my quotations, and I'm going to analyse those in depth there as well. So the golden rule, you need to know what all 15 are about, and then you're looking at 6 or 7 in depth. And the 6 or 7 in depth will come largely from you, and it's about making an informed decision. So we're just going to go through a few things here. The question will always look like the question that's on the slide. There's a lot going on this slide, so I'll go through a few bits. The question says there, compare how poets present a theme or the effects of a theme or the ways in which people are affected by a theme in something and one other poem from Power and Conflict. So if you look down the right-hand side of this slide, I've got previous themes, previous questions that have come up. So if you look here, we've got ideas, compare how poets present ideas about conflict in Bayonet Charge and one other poem from Power and Conflict. If you got that question, that is an absolute gift of a question, because you've got Bayonet Charge. Again, it might not be one of the poems you've revised, you might not particularly like it, but you've got a copy of it in front of you. There's plenty to talk about there. And the question says ideas about conflict. And this is where I'm going to say this again. That's why that's the most important bit, the theme. Ideas about conflict means, in theory, you could talk about any one of the other 14 poems there. You probably want something that's either similar to the conflict in Bayonet Charge or different, entirely different, but you could talk about anything. Power and control in London. Again, when it's talking about control as part of that question, you probably want a poem where someone else is controlled by something. But again, this is where some of you will start to make some quite interesting links between the poems. You know, control, kamikaze. You could look at the kamikaze pilot who is controlled by the state at the start, but makes his own decision at the end. So he's not controlled, but then that has an impact on his family. The other thing to say is, of course, that your exam may be marked by a teacher or an examiner who hasn't taught the Power and Conflict poems. They might have taught Love and Relationships. They will have read, they will know all of the Power and Conflict poems, but every time we get to, exam, they are given something called indicative content, which always says candidates, you should mark positively. Candidates will talk about any possible connections, but here are some poems you might see. And there are always poems we see more commonly. Bayonet Charge, we often see Exposure, we often see Remains. People revise these poems as group, which is fine. So the first thing to do is you can start setting yourselves practice questions based on that stem, because that will be what the stem looks like. You can make those as easy and difficult as you like. There will be some things you won't get. It will have to be something accessible for all students working from a grade 9 to a grade U. The poem, there's no easy or hard poem, but the question, the theme has to be accessible. So you probably won't see things like present the patriarchy in My Last Duchess and one other poem from Power and Conflict, because patriarchy is too complicated a theme. What we've tried to do is we've tried to look at 3 possible subgroups of ideas about these poems. Any that have got green, they contain more than one theme. So I'll talk about those in a minute as individuals. Any that are in blue have been on the exam. That might be an exam down the right-hand side. It might be something called specimen assessment materials, which AQA put together back in 2016, I think it was. So they have been used as an exam before. So first thing to say is, if you're looking at these and you're thinking, right, it says ideas about conflict, Bayonet Charge in 2022, that means that we won't get conflict and we won't get Bayonet Charge in 2023. Just be very, very careful. Don't try and predict what question or what poem you're going to get from AQA. Ozymandias has come up a couple of times. Bayonet Charge, you can see, has come up a couple of times there as well. So please don't try and think, oh, well, that's been up a couple of times, or that's been up once, it won't be up again. Please also, there's no such thing as an easy poem or a hard poem. You might find them easy, but other people won't. So anything is fair game on there. They're not trying to cut printing costs by not having the entire copy of extract from the prelude on the page. You'll hear all sorts of things. Most of them are largely nonsense. So just be mindful of this. I would encourage you to know what all 15 are about and then to revise 2 to 3 in depth from the following subgroups. War and conflict, and by conflict we mean kind of physical conflict really tied into war. Man or humanity or just general power, and nature, so the effect that nature has on other things. You will notice there's a lot of overlap with some of these. So any in green, so we've got exposure, which is obviously about war and the conditions in trench warfare, the boredom of war, but also the fact that the conditions, the weather, kills more people than actual gunfighting. That's a good poem because it's about war, but it's also about the power of nature. War photographer, about war and conflict, but also about the power of man and humanity. It's about this idea the war photographer goes around taking photos of war, but his power is very limited. He takes the photo and people, they just don't care at the end. They're not bothered about what he's got to say. Kamikaze, we've mentioned before. We think that's quite a useful one because it's about war and conflict. Obviously, it's about World War II, it's about kamikaze pilots. It's about the power of man, Bushido culture in Japan, the shame of the pilot for not completing his mission. He has the autonomy, the power to do that, but ultimately if he does that, his family shame him. And nature, because it's the beautiful imagery of Japan, you know, the fishing boat, the fish themselves, the tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous, that force him to abandon his mission. Tissue is a good one for man and humanity. Tissue, the idea that paper is used to control our lives. You know, from things like your GCSEs written on paper, your planners, maps too, quotation there. But ultimately, we as human beings, our living tissue is always more powerful. We can rip up maps, we can destroy them. Tissue, paper in inverted commas, can also be used to record our lives. Ozymandias, obviously you've got the idea of man, the power of Ozymandias as the ruler and the people he ruled against, but the idea that nature destroys his statue. Just looking at some other ones. Storm on the Island, obviously, is a poem about nature. The storm, if you take the surface meaning of Storm on the Island, the storm itself is more powerful than the people who think they are prepared, in inverted commas. And it's the huge nothing they fear, because you can't see a storm, but it can do a lot of damage. Man and humanity, Storm on the Island, obviously a metaphor for the Troubles, this idea that you don't necessarily recognise the people in parts of Ireland who are on the same side as you or are opposed to you politically as well, because ultimately lots of people don't go around talking about their political beliefs as well. So there's some of the green ones there that are quite useful because you can use them to answer more than one question. Some of the ones that haven't come up, some of the ones in black there, which basically they've not come up as an exam, they perhaps single themes. War and conflict, Charge of the Light Brigade. I suppose Charge of the Light Brigade, you could also talk about man. It's about the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, but it is also about the idea that the soldiers had no power to not follow the orders and they were all sent off to their death. My Last Duchess, again, a poem about the power that the Duke of Ferrara has. You know, he has the ability, he has the wealth to have a painting of the Duchess. All smiles stop together. He has her either killed or shut up in a convent, depending on which kind of part you believe, from Browning's kind of interview there as well. And then he boasts about his wealth, the statues that are cast at the end of the poem to the next, to the kind of someone who's come to arrange the marriage to the next Duchess he has. So he sees women as disposable pleasures. The Duchess is powerless to the power of this Duke. He's got too much power, much like Ozymandias, or the people in London, or the people who, kind of force the curriculum on the narrator of Checking Out My History. The Emigre, you've got a poem there about, obviously, a narrator who's from a particular area, a female narrator, an emigre, hence the extra E at the end, who either moves to a new place or her existing place is invaded by a new government, a new regime, and she doesn't recognise anymore. And she feels like she has to defend it. Lots of reference to sunlight there as well. Sunlight, I suppose, is technically natural, so you could have that link there. Checking Out My History, the curriculum, the white historical curriculum is forced on Guyanese citizens. They learn ridiculous nursery rhymes, such as the dish ran away with a spoon, but they don't learn about people like Nanny of the Maroons, Mary Seacole compared to Florence Nightingale, and the speaker is designed to carve his identity out at the end of the poem. An extract from the prelude in Nature, the narrator sees the mountain invokes a great sense of fear. It can be seen as a wider metaphor for the problems in life, but it has a profound psychological impact. So even some of those poems that haven't come up before, they're perhaps only about one thing. They might not be the ones that you're thinking, I might have that as a 6, 7, but some great themes and some great content in those poems there as well. So, I've got a list of the 15 poems there. The first thing to kind of say is just look at the 7 steps there. First thing, you need to understand what all 15 poems are about. And you need to really be thinking about how does the meaning change from the beginning to the end of each poem. So when we're looking at unseen poetry, we look at the beginning and the end. Years ago, probably about 10, 15 years ago, AQA used to ask questions like, compare the beginning of this poem with the beginning of another poem. I don't think they will do that. I think that's too challenging for some students, and it's too specific, I think, as well. but beginnings and ends of poems are deliberately put there by the poets to have an effect on the reader. The last line of every single one of these poems is absolute gold dust for you to mention in your exam. You may even start, look at the type of questions you're going to be asked. Conflict in bayonet charge, terror's touchy dynamite. You may start by using that and comparing that with the last line of another poem. So last lines are a great place to start. And the beginning is a great place to start because there is a change in each of these poems. Think about unseen poetry, we've looked at that. Make sure you know one main quotation from each poem. You probably will without knowing it. They're the ones you've done in class. That's the most obvious. If I really had to talk about this poem, that's what I'm going to say. Then select 6 or 7 poems, 2 about the effects of war or conflict, 2 about the power of man or humanity, 2 about the power of nature, and I would say if you can, kamikaze, because it unlocks a lot of things, and revise those in detail. And when we say revise in detail or depth, number 4, I mean pick 2 or 3 quotations from the poem. That's all you're going to have time to talk 45 minutes. 2 or 3 quotations, and then make an essay plan for that poem. What words from your quotations would you analyse? So terror's touchy dynamite there, for instance, this idea, touchy there as an adjective, or dynamite as a noun choice. Who is the dynamite? What am I going to talk about that? What words would you analyse there in depth? Write this down on your cue cards, your jigsaws of knowledge, wherever you keep these things, and commit them to memory. What context or wider ideas can you discuss? And what deeper meanings can you discuss as well? The mark scheme is all about meanings. You're picking quotations that allow you to explore surface level meanings and deeper meanings. The touchy dynamite, is this a dynamite thrown on a battleground? Is this the dynamite of the soldier himself? Checking out my history, the speaker who's going to carve out their identity, how successful are they going to be? Realistically, are they going to overthrow the system? Number 5, this is more looking at writing your answers up here. The theme in the question is absolutely key. Lots of students get into the exam, they flick through the exam booklet, look at the inspector calls question, look at the poetry question, and you can see people go, oh, yes, it was this. Oh, it was Charge of the Light Brigade. Get in there, I've revised that. Oh, it was Storm on the Island. I don't get that. You will do this when you come out of the exam and you come and find us and you talk to us about this. It's not about the question, the poem you get, it's about the theme you get in the question. That's the most important thing. And that is what you compare. When you get given a poem, whatever one of the 15s it is, you're comparing ideas in both poems. Why has somebody bothered to write a poem about the effects of war? What are they trying to say about the effects of war in that poem? And how is that similar or different to what someone else has done in another poem? That's what this poem means. And when we talk about context for number 4, ideas are part of context. If you're talking about a war photographer, for instance, who takes thousands of photos and no one cares about them, and he's alone in his studio suffering, spools of suffering there, looking at all these images and picking the best ones to send to an editor who puts it on the front page of a newspaper and people don't care, they're the ideas. How are the effects of war similar to Poppies? Well, they're not. Poppies is a completely different poem. It's about a mother mourning the loss of her son. And that's fine. They can be. Comparison means similarity, but most of the time it means different. Each one of these 15 poems are different to each other, and that's fine. You get marks for exploring and discussing those differences, considering the deeper meanings there as well. And the big thing is you should aim to write for 45 minutes. You need to get to a stage where you can write 2 to 3 analysis paragraphs per poem in that time. So what we'd say to do is, let's say you get given effects of war and its exposure in the exam. You talk about exposure in one paragraph, you do some language analysis there, you talk about some of the ideas. Similarly, in Remains, the effects of war are shown through the PTSD of the soldier. You do some analysis, then you consider why they're similar or different. You're basically going to be writing 4 to 6 paragraphs in total, 2 to 3 per poem. 1 or 2 of those are going to contain in-depth language analysis, the kind of brilliant paragraphs that we see from you day in, day out, where you've gone into real depth on one word as well. You haven't got time to do it in every single paragraph. One paragraph might be where you discuss ideas in more depth, but aim for 2 to 3 paragraphs per poem, certainly no less than 2 paragraphs per poem. Aim to pick out and talk about the quotations that allow you to say the most. I've mentioned last lines. I think the last lines of every single one of these poems are superb and great for analysis. You might then go into your exam and you're writing about the last line of Charge of the Light Brigade and the effect of conflict presented in the last line, the Noble 600, comparing that with the touchy dynamite of Bayonet Charge, for instance. So they're the 7 steps for you to follow. First thing, all 15 poems, and then you need to start picking your 6 or 7. And we are going to start wanting to see your 6 and 7 as English teachers very, very soon as well. We want you to know which ones you're going to focus at in detail. If you can do 15, that's absolutely superb, but prioritise those 6 or 7, 2 war, 2 man, 2 nature, and ideally the ones in green where you can use them to talk about more than one thing as well. And good luck with your revision.